Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. It's a delight to welcome you all. My name is Ben Self. I'm Vice President of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. I'm working with Kim White on this series of webinars on U.S. Japan cooperation in the post-COVID era, sponsored by the Embassy of Japan here in Washington. Our friends in the Public Affairs section have generously funded this series of programs that we thought was important to highlight all the different ways that the U.S. and Japan have deep and longstanding cooperation in different subfields. And we've looked at space, and we've looked at other aspects of bilateral cooperation and its history, going back even to the occupation period. So this is kind of the capstone event, and we're looking at this specifically as a functional area of U.S.-Japan defense cooperation in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And I'm so grateful to our three panelists for joining us today. They could be out enjoying the cherry blossoms or flying a kite in our windy DC area weather, or Lieutenant Colonel Deckard out in Hawaii. Well, there's nothing to do outdoors in Hawaii anyway, but he has also gotten up early to join us because it's before 9, or it's just 9 a.m. there. HADR is an important area, and an area that, to me, exemplifies the multifaceted nature of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And before we start the event, I just wanted to highlight that the U.S.-Japan alliance really is a force for good in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, and the world as a whole. And obviously, its main function is providing deterrence and stability and regional security, but it is in that multifaceted way able to provide other public goods. And we just wanted to highlight one of those in HADR. We're so pleased to have three wonderful voices on that. I think our order of presentation is first Dr. Andrew Oros from Washington College, and then Lieutenant Colonel Michael Luke Deckard from the U.S. Air Force, and finally Commander Veronica Kennedy from the U.S. Navy. And you've all seen their bios on the invitation. I won't waste more time or take more time away from them to tell you about how great they are. But they all have wonderful connections to the Mansfield Foundation. And I just want to thank them and the sponsors of the programs that have brought them into contact, into our orbit. And Dr. Oros is both a member of our U.S.-Japan Network for the Future, funded by the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, where he's been a close part of our community of U.S.-Japan specialists for many, many years. But he's also been part of our Bridging the Divide program funded by the Korea Foundation, helping Japan specialists in the United States understand Korea better. And now he's part of the first cohort of our Mansfield Loose Asia Scholars Program, which is really trying to integrate the understandings of Northeast and Southeast Asia and see how those two subregions have really integrated into one dynamic and critically important region for the United States. So we're grateful to Andrew Oros for being part of so many of our programs. Lieutenant Colonel Deckard is a member of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Fellowship Program. And as you've seen, he was in Tokyo prior to his current post in Hawaii, and as a Mansfield Fellow was able to work both within the government, self-defense forces, and some private sector organizations, and really develop his understanding of how the Japanese policymaking process works in defense policy. And Veronica Kennedy is a member of our 25th anniversary silver class of Mike Mansfield Fellows. She has not yet been able to deploy to Japan due to the coronavirus restrictions, but we're hoping that she'll be traveling over there this summer to spend a year likewise learning about the policymaking process and building connections with her counterparts in Japan. And I'd like to thank the State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs for funding the Mansfield Fellowship Program, again, through our 25th year, really part of the fabric of U.S.-Japan cooperation, as I said earlier, across so many different areas, including humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Sorry for talking so long. I think everybody who's attending has been able to log in, and I'll be able to turn it over to to our panelists, starting with Andrew.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks to the Mansfield Foundation for not just organizing this panel, but also for all of these great opportunities that it's afforded me over the years. I think that an institution that's founded on cross-national interaction is especially important in these days of the pandemic. I'm really happy to be here. I think that this topic has special resonance this month, which is the 10th anniversary year of the 3/11 incidents in Japan, which I understand my co-panelists here have on-the-ground experience with. I had a much more modest contribution to relief efforts with 3/11 in the 1 year after that, after especially the effects of the tsunami, when I took a group of 18 Washington College students to the affected area, or one of the affected areas, a village called Higashimatsushima. And we spent a day meeting with local people, witnessing the continued dislocation even a year after the tsunami really devastated that town, seeing roads that were still blocked, people still living in relief trailers, and just the general disruption of life. It was gratifying to be able to spend a day working with locals and bringing 18 young people with me who could help shovel out mud from drainage ditches and help clear out paths, things that were still really needed. And it just underscored to me how much of a positive role we heard again and again from local people that U.S. forces in Japan played in the relief efforts, and also Japan's own self-defense forces played, both immediately after and also over time. And more broadly, just linked to the theme of this panel, what we witnessed at that time, and I've seen since then, is many continuing examples of U.S. Japan cooperation that are beyond our formal alliance, including some U.S. schools that adopted Japanese schools in that affected area afterwards, service organizations that were donating support and often whether labor or monetary support. And I think that this experience of working together and building a joint solidarity for our actions is certainly one of the added benefits of HADR activities that's beyond the core goal of actually providing relief to people who are suffering. And there have been many panels in this past month that have been commemorating Operation Tomodachi and U.S. Japan Cooperation related to 3/11, and a number of them focused on lessons learned from this experience. I co-wrote a short article a few years after 3/11 that built on this kind of lessons learned idea of U.S. Japan cooperation in relief efforts after Typhoon Haiyan devastated the Philippines in November of 2013. And we're short on time, so if you'd like to Google it, it's still available online, and you can see some of those lessons learned. But I'll just note one point from that article as I was rereading it myself in preparation for this panel. At that time, that operation was the Japan Self-Defense Forces' largest contingent that had been dispatched overseas on a mission. It involved about 1,000 people. And interestingly, in today's context, one of the primary activities that the Japan Self-Defense Forces did at the time was administer vaccinations. And this reminds me of the recent decision by the US and Japan, together with Australia and India, which we now call the Quad framework, to deliver 100 million doses of COVID vaccination to Southeast Asia by 2022. So that, I think, provides a bit of a bridge to think, well, we're now like 7 years beyond that Operation Haiyan, 10 years after Tomodachi. And of course, natural disasters haven't ceased. And indeed, the incidence of natural disasters is expected to increase because of the effects of climate change. So it's especially something I think we should be thinking about. And obviously, I'm talking to you via Zoom in the middle of a global pandemic. So it's all on our minds, I think, about the role that we can all play in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So with that broader kind of framing context, that's kind of what scholars do. Before I pass off to the practitioners here, I'd like to just offer two observations and one caution on this broader topic, and then I'll hand it off. The first observation is that clearly we've seen from past experience, like some of the examples I've just given, that the US and Japan together can make a huge difference in regional humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. Together we save lives and we reduce suffering, and that's clearly a good thing. The second is that this act of working together has benefits for both of our countries in other ways as well. And I want to mention two examples of that. One is that it provides additional training to forces from both of our countries, plus training in actually working together. So I imagine that you'll hear some specific examples of this from my fellow panelists. I don't have direct experience with that, but as a teacher, I can tell you that learning by doing in general is a lot more successful than watching it on a video or hearing about it in a classroom. And plus, in the case of HADR, it's obviously a very time-sensitive, stressful moment, which again, I think provides crucial real-world experience about operating in a stressful, time-urgent conditions that I think is useful for our forces. And a second sort of added benefit I think we see from this is, of course, it generates a lot of goodwill regionally, including, I think, a deeper appreciation of the positive roles that the US alliance system plays in the region, and also how Japan's defensive operations have reformed and evolved since Japan's militarist period decades and decades ago, and also how Japan's operations have reformed since its strongly anti-militarist period during the Cold War. My last book was called Japan's Security Renaissance, and it sought to convey to a wider audience that Japanese thinking about security and actions, especially regionally, have changed quite a bit in this past decade. And we need to be honest that there are some concerns about these directions from Japan, and there's quite a lot of misinformation and disinformation about Japan's security roles. So the more that people in the region see the high level of training and capabilities of Japan's self-defense forces, I think the better, in my view. And finally, just a caution as my concluding point. I think we also must be realistic about not stretching each of our country's forces too thin. So for US forces, we're operating far from home, and the US is expanding its focus into the so-called Indo-Pacific region. We've renamed the command, right? As I'm sure we'll hear a little more about. And so we're engaging in more operations as well to respond to China's increased naval and air force presence. So we're already doing a lot. And in addition, it's in addition to how the US and Japan might work together with HADR, we work together in multilateral training exercises already. And so in some cases that might be more efficient. And on the Japan side, sticking with this stretching thin theme, in addition to the Japanese forces, self-defense forces also engaging more in response to China and North Korea's provocative actions, Japan has the additional challenge of worsening population demographics. Japan's shrinking and aging population is the subject of my current book project, which is called America's Aging Allies in Asia, which I hope to come back to the Mansfield Foundation to give a talk or Zoom about when it's released in a year or so. But my sort of final takeaway points will close on that. One is that I think the US and Japan are going to need to work together to devise ways for Japan to continue its expanded role in the US-Japan alliance and in regional security, despite Japan's shrinking working age population. and likely future pressure to divert military spending to more support for its elderly population. And secondly, I do think nonetheless that there are a number of ways to do this by better utilizing labor-saving technologies and jointly developing new technologies between the US and Japan to cope with new security challenges, including HADR. And actually, the Mansfield Foundation has done some great events on US Japan cooperation and technology. Still, HADR at its core is a very labor-intensive activity, as I imagine we're going to hear about in just a moment from the other panelists. So I think that there has been discussion within defense circles in Japan that one way to cope with the growing stresses of an inadequate supply of personnel in the future would be to spin off HADR away from the self-defense forces into its own kind of organization. And I think maybe that's a topic also that would be a good topic for a Mansfield discussion all by itself. But I'm concerned that that approach would then lessen some of the broader benefits we get from doing HADR together as an alliance framework, as I've just mentioned. So I'm going to end with that caution in the hopes of provoking some exchange in the Q&A and hand it off to our practitioners here. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a wonderful overview, and really appreciate your focus on this issue in the past, really enabling you to give us that perspective today. I'll go next to Lieutenant Colonel Deckard.
Okay, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Dr. Oros. Those were definitely some excellent points. Aloha from Hawaii. Beautiful sunny morning here in Hawaii. I hope it's beautiful everywhere else in the world, wherever you're calling in from. So I've got two parts to my discussion that I will try to keep brief. I've got 2 pages of notes. First, I'm going to talk about my time during Operation Tomodachi, the humanitarian assistance that the U.S. provided to Japan after the earthquake and tsunami, and then some information from U.S. Indo-PACOM. That is correct. It is now officially Indo-PACOM, has been for about 3 years now, even though some people call it PACOM for short still, and how we conduct HADR and opportunities for U.S. Japan HADR in the future. So briefly, my time during Operation Tomodachi, I was part of a unit, the 353rd Special Operations Group out of Okinawa. We didn't work frequently with Japan prior to Operation Tomodachi. Of course, the disaster hit. We flew up to Yokota immediately, Yokota Air Base in Tokyo, and didn't know exactly what we were going to do when we got there. Determined that with our unique capabilities and the destruction at Sendai Airport, that would be our #1 goal, is to reopen Sendai Airport. And that is where the operational and government level planning happened with Japan, facilitated through USFJ. USFJ, or U.S. Forces Japan, facilitates this at almost every level when it comes to the U.S. military, and even sometimes at the U.S. government level. And so we immediately went into planning with our government counterparts, primarily as a means to explain how we would be able to reopen Sendai, what kind of support we needed from them, and direct all of that through USFJ to get the support that we needed from the government of Japan. There was a lot of resistance at first, a lot of misunderstanding of the capabilities that we had. So there was a lot of detailed explanation of how we would be able to conduct these missions. You know, just from Japan being so organized throughout the years, it was very difficult to explain, hey, you know, although there's no power, there's no air traffic control in the area, there's no instrument approaches into any of these runways. Dr. Oros, I know you talked about the Higashi Matsushima. That's actually where we flew into, was Matsushima. Oh, and the weather was terrible as well. So it took a lot of operational level planning at my level to explain to the government of Japan how we were going to get in there, how we were going to conduct these missions. And after a couple of days, it all worked out perfectly. We had an enormous amount of support from the JSDF on the ground at Matsushima. They moved with the group from Matsushima to Sendai to finally reopen Sendai. And in just a matter of days after the tsunami hit, Sendai was reopened. And that was all in coordination through U.S. Japan planning facilitated by USFJ. What was interesting about that kind of operational level planning was it didn't happen before Operation Tomodachi. That didn't happen frequently. So that kind of started the path to fast forward to 10 years from then now. The level of communication that we maintain with the government of Japan at the military level is very in part due to Operation Tomodachi. There's communication mechanisms that have been established or re-established after that incident that now allow us to work closer than ever for any kind of contingency, HADR, exercise, emergency response, no matter what it is. A lot of that was developed out of Operation Tomodachi. So fast forwarding now to my current position at INDOPACOM. It's amazing in the last 10 years. You know, I thought I was working closely with Japan during Operation Tomodachi. I'm in a very fortunate position now at INDOPACOM to work closer with Japan than I ever have in the past. You know, working directly with the Japan Joint Staff through these coordination mechanisms, not just regularly, but almost on a daily basis. So speaking INDOPACOM specific only right now, INDOPACOM has our own campaign plan. One of the aspects of that campaign plan is to strengthen our allies and partners. So as part of strengthening our allies and partners in HADR, building resilience to disaster relief, we have 3 LOEs or 3 lines of effort to do this. And I'm just going to list these out. So first is to build partner nation capacity to prepare for disasters and to mitigate their effects. Second is to empower response and recovery immediately before, during, and after a crisis. Third is enable partner nation leadership and resiliency efforts. Now, these LOEs are for the entire region, not just for Japan. One of the great things about working with Japan so closely in HADR is these LOEs aren't necessarily to build Japan's HADR capacity, but to work with Japan to build other HADR capacity throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Those 3 LOEs are primarily done through security cooperation, and security cooperation is the military's ability to export training to other countries. This is something that the JSDF does as well, and we often coordinate and synchronize our security cooperation to try to make sure that we're not stepping on each other's toes as we go out through the Indo-Pacific region and conduct this type of training. And another way we do this is training in Hawaii. Now that is something that's US run only. However, Japan does participate in this. And what I'm talking about specifically is we have what's called a Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance. To give it an acronym and to be short, it's called CFEDM. So CFEDM is it's here in Hawaii. It's a direct reporting unit to US INDOPACOM. The mission is, and I'm going to read this as well, CFEDM builds crisis response capacity in the US and partner militaries, enhances coordination and collaboration with civilian and foreign partners, and strengthens those relationships to save lives and alleviate human suffering before, during, and after humanitarian crisis. CFEDM provides training to all levels of HADR professionals, from those who are actually conducting the mission at ground level to senior leadership in the military or in their government to provide leadership aspects that can control and help throughout an HADR once a disaster hits their country. Japan has participated in these CFEDM classes, and they still do. More of how we tie HADR with Japan at US INDOPACOM is kind of as I spoke to before, security cooperation. I want to touch on that a little bit more. So first of all, HADR is a unilateral effort. We do not bilaterally go out and conduct HADR missions with Japan. So if something happens to the Philippines, I think most everyone on this network knows how it's requested. It's requested from the host nation through the embassy to the country, and then it has to be approved. And so there's no bilateral coordination mechanism between the US and Japan that gets us on the ground together working bilaterally under the same C2 or command and control structure. So the way that we project our bilateral HADR is through security cooperation. Security cooperation is coordinated through various meetings. We have monthly meetings within my office alone with Japan. We talk about much more than just HADR, but HADR is one of those. And so, for example, if there's a crisis that's about to happen, although we don't have the authority to say that we're going to go help out during that crisis, we will coordinate in advance to talk about what we may be able to provide to that crisis if asked to do so. And those kinds of meetings happen at every level at US INDOPACOM within our directorates. For those of you who know the staff levels, J1, J2, J3, J4, almost every single one of our J directorates coordinates with Japan on a very frequent exchange. There's also multiple forums, dialogues, and of course through CFEDM that we talk about HADR, train each other on HADR. Japan is very capable in HADR, as many of you know. They have so many disasters within their country every year, and they do not always need the assistance of the US, and so we're not always there helping out, even though we're always ready to help out. But the JSDF is actively helping out every summer during their humanitarian crises that they have. So I think I'm getting close to my time here. So talk about the next big opportunity that I believe that we have with the JSDF, that is, on HADR. And Dr. Oros, as you mentioned, Quad member countries working together for COVID vaccinations. Now, the Quad right now is at the diplomatic level. It's not a military Quad level membership. However, there's potential for that in the future, I believe. And if that ever occurs, I think Quad level member countries sharing HADR training, exporting that kind of security cooperation, supporting COVID vaccinations throughout the Indo-Pacific is the next step for U.S. Japan cooperation with HADR. And that's all I have. I hope I'm not over time. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Ben. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was so informative and really, to me, extremely interesting. And I have questions. I hope our audience can also chime in with some questions. But before we get to those, I'm turning to Commander Kennedy for her insights and both past, present, and future perspectives on U.S.-Japan cooperation in HADR. Veronica, please.
Thanks very much, Ben. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody who's attending. Thanks for joining us today. This particular subject and this event are very near and dear to my heart. Like Lieutenant Colonel Deckard, I was stationed in Sasebo, Japan in 2011 on an amphib, the USS Tortuga, LSD 46. And at the time we were in port in Sasebo that Friday. It was a Friday, and most of our crew had already departed for the day, for the weekend, I believe in preparation for an upcoming underway the following week. So it was, meant to be a very happy Friday afternoon, likely full of revelry for most of our crew. And things changed very quickly. As we've already had some of the academic background and a lot of, the process and the structure behind it. I would very much like to talk about, kind of the human aspect of what HADR in this particular instance meant for the crew and for what we saw from our Japanese partners and neighbors as well. So like I mentioned, it was a Friday in the afternoon. I was on duty on the ship at the time. This will be a little bit anecdotal, so forgive me for if it goes a little bit too deeply into that. But and I was eating dinner in our ship's wardroom. That's the officer's mess. with the TV on, was by myself at the time, and I saw what I thought at the time was a movie clip. And it was imagery of a giant wave engulfing the coastline of Japan. And honestly, I thought I was watching a disaster movie at the time. It wasn't until I changed the channel several times and I realized that this was playing across all of the news networks, and it was happening. It had just happened, just several hundred miles from us down in Sasebo. For those unfamiliar with the geography, Sasebo is on the island of Kyushu, essentially in the deep south of the four main islands of Japan. So we were not near the epicenter of the disaster itself, but as a naval vessel, we knew right off the bat that we were going to be asked to respond immediately, especially as an amphib. And because of the unique capabilities that that type of vessel could bring to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. We were underway that very night, and it was perilous. We had to recall the crew, and actually for our commanding officer, for the ship's captain, he had recently taken command of the ship, and this was his very first underway as the captain of the vessel in response to this disaster and for an emergency underway. I actually have some photos from this event that I'll go ahead and share while I go through this. But so that was USS Tortuga. Several days after, just a couple of days afterwards, we departed Sasebo and went via the Sea of Japan. And we stopped at South Korea actually to pick up two MH-53 heavy lift helicopters. And then we proceeded straight north to the port of Hakodate in Hokkaido, up in the north of Japan. So what we proceeded to do there is that we unloaded Japanese ground self-defense force vehicles and troops. At the time, it was the largest movement of Japanese troops and vehicles by a US warship, and I believe it may still hold that record. I'm not certain, a lot of things have happened since then, but it was a significant movement, and it was something that no one really had any experience doing. Like Lieutenant Colonel Deckard described, this was something that we were learning fast. The scope and scale was something entirely new. We had done HADR there's a lot of training that goes into this. A lot of the time our exercises, especially when we're coordinating with foreign partners and allies in this region, are exercises for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. This was new and everyone on the crew knew it. The sense of urgency was palpable. And when it came down to it, it was important to know, this was a photo of our deck as we had, right before we departed Hachinohe with the equipment unloaded. We had several hundred ground self-defense force troops on board. You can see some of them walking across the flight deck there. And it was, our entire well deck was also full of vehicles. It was a sight to behold. And the thing that impressed me the most, I think, was that our sailors on board the ship, by the nature of their jobs, their work is exhausting. It's round the clock. There are watchstanders driving the ship. There are engineers down in the bowels, turning wrenches and making sure that everything is in proper working order. But the sense that I got from the majority of the crew, and in reminiscing with some of our other shipmates about this, especially on the 10th anniversary when a lot of us were talking about it, was that there was this intrinsic desire in everyone to do more. I think that this was truly a unique disaster relief effort because the Tortuga, the ship, was home ported in Sasebo, and the key word there was home. For a lot of our sailors, who could be as young as 18 or 19 years old and as senior as it gets, for a lot of our sailors, this, Sasebo and Japan as a whole were home as much as any other duty station may have been throughout their careers. And there was this real sense of devastation in the sense that this was, these were family members of our next door neighbors. These were, family members of our friends. These were our friends. And I think that was really driven home by this particular event. And there was despite that overlay of perpetual exhaustion, there was this constant question of what can we do to help more. As I think was mentioned earlier, the weather was not always very helpful, especially when we were farther up north. All of the equipment and our weather decks were very often snowed in, and standing watch at anchor was particularly unpleasant if you had to be out on the weather decks to endure some of this. Once we departed Hachinohe, we headed south to Aomori and anchored in the bay there just outside Aomori, and proceeded to do well deck operations. As you can see, that's the stern gate of the vessel is open. So that's a view from behind of the ship. And we would launch LCUs with the ground self-defense force vehicles and then the troops on board. So that way we could move them the whole purpose of this was to move the troops and vehicles from Hokkaido and where their home base was down south, so they could proceed with their own relief efforts in the affected areas. It was cold. It was hard work and round the clock, as mentioned before. And it was this interesting, constant sense of anticipation. We didn't know how long anything would take. We didn't know what we would be asked to do next. That's a view from inside the well deck out at the LCU as the vehicles were being loaded and they're getting ready to depart to bring them ashore. It was, like I said, a remarkable effort. I think that at any time that we're doing this sort of operation, these relief efforts, there's a sense of, this mission has a higher purpose, but in this particular time, it was personal for a lot of our sailors on board. I do remember we often had media on board because there was this, it was important to show that, the solidarity between our crews and our efforts, and then, the real, the efforts being made by the self-defense forces as well, and how we were working hand in hand to accomplish this. But, it was important to note that part of what makes this kind of effort so important is the respect that needed to be given to the host nation's desires. That was really a really important factor behind our work in assisting the self-defense force. We did things and we didn't do things depending on what the government of Japan and the self-defense force coordinated with us. At one point, one of the darker turns is once we had departed Aomori, we proceeded down the east coast of Japan. We were off the coast of Hachinohe. As we would steam through the night, it was very dangerous. We were dodging Connex boxes floating in the water and roofs of houses. And at one point, some of our watchstanders on the bridge found a body floating in the water. And I was working in the engineering department at the time, and with my paltry efforts, my paltry excuse of Japanese language, I was called up to the bridge so I can try and contact the Japanese Coast Guard via our bridge-to-bridge radios. So we hailed the Japanese Coast Guard, let them know of what we had found, passed on the coordinates, and they said, "Thank you very much, we'll take it from here." And it was, yeah, many of us were confused at first, didn't understand. And then once it was explained to us, it was because, you know, they wanted to ensure that, you know, they were able to give the dignity to the recovery effort that they wanted to. And at that point, it was like, understood completely. You've got this, and we'll stand aside and we'll continue to let you know if we find anything else worth reporting. As you know, this particular underway was many weeks of work. We were one of many ships and aircraft that got underway for this. I think it was at least 140 aircraft and at least 20 U.S. ships that responded. And it included the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group and the Essex Amphibious Readiness Group. The USS Tortuga was part of the Essex ARG, and we were deployed in support of Operation Tomodachi. And it was really, you know, hey, as much as everything, you know, that we've discussed before, I think there was a mention that, you know, this really is an important opportunity to build skills in seamanship, training with our foreign counterparts, and as well as, you know, honing the skills of our sailors in the U.S. Navy. This here was a photo from a nighttime underway replenishment that was done out of necessity. That's a photo from our deck, and that's a photo of the supply ship, and we're barely 100 feet apart, refueling and transferring supplies from one another. So this was an important effort across the board. And I think that when it was done, everyone was very tired, but had something of a sense of satisfaction and something of a sense of, like I mentioned before, that they wish they could have done more. I know that many of our sailors, for our vessel, we were transporting explosive ordnance, the EOD specialists who were going with a salvage ship into various ports and trying to clear the debris and the damage so that way they could open them back up to shipping and trade, and kind of return a sense of normalcy to those ports. And for the sailors on board, a lot of the time that was, you know, we didn't get to see the fruit, they didn't get to see the fruit of that labor. And you would always get the questions of, you know, is there a possibility that some of us can go ashore and, you know, help actually, you know, move debris and, you know, put in the backbreaking labor besides what's going on. So I think that always was the most impressive thing to me about all of these sailors, that despite everything that they were going through, this was taxing physically, it was taxing mentally, they still wanted to give more. This is just a photo of an example of what the seas were like at that time. You'll notice the horizon and the deck of the ship are not parallel in any way whatsoever. So there was, we call it securing for sea to make sure things like printers don't go flying off of desks and shattering against the bulkhead. But it's important to note that both from the U.S. Navy's perspective and from the Japanese Self-Defense Forces perspective, everything about HADR is very human from the ground up. And we talk a lot about the organization, and it's so important to make sure that we have a system in place. That's well practiced. But every situation is going to be different. At the end of the day, it's up to those individuals, those hardworking people who want to do something good that will truly affect the outcome of these sorts of operations. So that's what I have. I think I went definitely over my time. I apologize, but I had some photos that I really wanted to get out there. So thanks very much. And that's all I have. Back to you, Ben.
Well, thank you so much, Veronica. I found that incredibly interesting and moving. And I really appreciate the way the three of you have given us the Zoom process from the 30,000 foot view to the tactical aircraft height altitude view, right down to surface sea level view, and also from the structures at the alliance relationship level to the bilateral coordination mechanisms, right down to the individuals. I think it's been extremely fortunate to have the perspectives from the three of you, and now we have some Q&A time. I'd like to go back up to the high altitude view briefly and get Andrew's participation on a question about the scope, the geographic scope of where the US and Japan might cooperate in future HADR efforts. And it's already been clear that they don't implement HADR as a bilateral effort, but we do deconflict and we do cooperate in preparation for future disasters, obviously, as Lieutenant Colonel Deckard mentioned. We coordinate some of the security cooperation efforts. Correct me if I'm wrong, my recollection is that the first major Japanese overseas HADR effort was in Africa with the Goma Zaire, then the country of Zaire, now Congo, dealing with a major refugee crisis coming out of the Rwanda genocide. There was a huge camp in Goma, and Japan dispatched outside of the UN framework, just as an HADR mission, some ground self-defense forces to try and help address the security needs of that Goma catastrophe and provide a humanitarian assistance. It wasn't a disaster, it was a man-made crisis. And there's clearly a security deficit in many parts of the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa, where Japan's contributions were meaningful and helpful. But as you mentioned, Japan is focusing more narrowly. It's drawing back a little bit from global reach ambitions in terms of its security role. I'm wondering how we find the right balance, where what is the scale and how much can the US and Japan coordinate on an Indo-Pacific scale of HADR cooperation? What do you think, Andy?
I think that's a challenging question, but an excellent question. You know, every country in the region that has adopted this Indo-Pacific idea of a broader conception of the region has defined it a little bit differently, like what the scope of that is. But I think that a commonality between the US and Japan is thinking about the Indian Ocean side and how much activity we want to be engaged in there. And my own personal view is that you know, that's quite a bigger lift to get capabilities that far away from Japan and from US. You know, the major US bases in the Indo-Pacific are in East Asia, right? There is some other presence, and of course we have security partners. I mean, Singapore is an excellent security partner, and we use facilities there. But I think that's a challenge. But I guess what I would say is that if we want to be genuine in our conception of the region as the Indo-Pacific, then I think we need to think more about how we would provide assistance in the Indian Ocean region as well as on the Pacific side. But I don't think the details have been worked out, would be my immediate take.
Well, thank you. I like us to keep in mind that the US and Japan have so much capacity that we could be meeting unmet needs on a larger scope and not just focus narrowly on Japan and its immediate environs. I have too many questions, but we have audience questions, and it's a disservice to our fine audience for me to keep talking. I have a question about, I'll just read it. So amazing to see the photos from 311 movement of Hilo's vehicle supplies troops. Because this was an operation in Japan rather than jointly moving to a third location, were there any tensions about command and control? Was command assigned to the US military and to the Japanese forces when ashore? Can Commander Kennedy describe a bit more about chain of command in such a joint operations situation? Thanks.
I can speak a little bit to this. I think possibly Lieutenant Colonel Deckard might also have some inputs, but to my knowledge from my research at the time, again, I was mostly on the deck plates. So when it came to the command and control aspect of it, I learned a lot about it after the fact. But there was a conscious effort on the side of the U.S. DoD to ensure that a lot of the decision making was in the hands of the Japanese government, because this was their country, and we wanted to ensure that despite our massive presence there, we wanted to ensure that we were respecting their decision making, and a lot of our role was in an advisory position, as well as just in the providing the labor aspect. There was no the command and control of the ships themselves, stayed within the United States's chain of command. But a lot of the time, it was a matter of where do you need us, and then Seventh Fleet would make a decision on where each ship would go and what mission they would undertake. I don't know if Lieutenant Colonel Deckard might have more input there.
Yeah, Veronica, I have a little more input, but at that time I was similar to your situation, more boots on the ground, lower level. I wasn't actually part of that C2 structure. I do know that nothing was done without coordination with the government of Japan. Anything and everything that we did had to be approved through Japan. The U.S. would have set up their own task force, and I can't remember if there was a name given to it during that time. So all U.S. personnel would have fallen under that task force, and then the commander of that task force would have coordinated through USFJ with the government of Japan and the JSDF to ensure that everything was deconflicted. However, it was not, again, it was not bilateral. It wasn't a U.S. commander directing JSDF operations or vice versa. It was mostly consultation, getting requests, needs, and then tasking those down through U.S. channels after we got those from the government of Japan.
Thank you. That sort of sets up the next question from Captain James Arita, U.S. Air Force. I think he's also in Hawaii, particularly for Lieutenant Colonel Deckard. There hasn't been as much C2 cooperation. There is no, as he says, no C2 mechanism for a bilateral U.S.-Japan HADR response in the region. You've already explained that. His question is, has thought been given to overhauling the current bilateral relationship to further integrate U.S. and Japan forces, or perhaps pursue a model similar to Korea's Combined Forces Command?
Very good question. In terms of HADR, the answer to that is I think a relatively simple no. Because it is a unilateral response, it wouldn't work out. It would just overcomplicate things, even if we did try to do that. In terms of coordination just with Japan, outside of HADR, I think we do have actually a very robust coordination system to communicate between the two militaries. But again, I think something like Korea has the CFC, which was born out of an actual contingency, is not going to work with Japan, and with the challenges of the Indo-Pacific right now.
Thanks for that answer. I wonder about at least mapping out what capabilities exist in terms of HADR, all the way down to equipment, and setting up a kind of plug and play or a la carte menu, so that, say, the Philippines faced a disaster similar to Haiyan, they might be able to say, we want all of this capability that the US brings and that Japan brings, and we want you to actually integrate that. And that would, if we had that map, would we be able to actually functionally cooperate on the ground more effectively? I'm curious, Andrew, you also wrote on this, but first, go ahead, Luke.
I absolutely think so. And I don't know if that exists. If it doesn't, I agree that something like that would be a great way forward between the U.S. and Japan to cooperate with HADR. I think that would be more at the component level at the services. So U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, within the Indo-Pacific. And I know, Veronica, I know you've been out here, the U.S. Navy and the JMSDF cooperate very, very closely, closer than all the other services. And perhaps they even have something like that. But there's no direction for each of the services to have that kind of roadmap for HADR cooperation. But if we did, then I think that would be a fantastic opportunity for us to deconflict what kind of HADR we can provide outside or throughout the region.
And I do know that, especially between the United States Navy and the JMSDF, we are, constantly in a state of interoperability, but really there's this desire to move into what we coin interchangeability. When you talk about the plug and play aspects, there's this desire to really take this, this foundational relationship and to continue to build on it. And that might be part of the future of what the new capabilities that would permit us to exercise. So.
Well, we have time, and we have one more question I'd like to read from James Gannon, also a member of our U.S. Japan Network for the Future, a good friend of the Mansfield Foundation. He writes, humanitarian NGOs play a key role in international humanitarian responses. The U.S. military makes efforts to involve NGOs in its training planning. Are you aware of whether there have been efforts to involve Japanese and American NGOs alongside military in U.S.-Japan joint HADR exercises? I think I'd ask you to blow that up and talk about the ability of the U.S.-Japan alliance as an entity to engage the NGOs, whether they're U.S., Japanese, or international, more broadly. Andrew, would you start?
Sure. I was just thinking, like, the name of the series that we're a part of these webinars is looking at U.S. Japan cooperation in the world, like 2020 and beyond. And it seems to me that one area that I'm often participating in, thinking about, is in military technology cooperation, right? We're often looking to our private firms to develop the technology, like in cyber, for example, right? That's beyond what the alliance controls in the military. And I see this as a kind of an analogy, Jim Gannon's question, that, in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, the militaries are just one part of this picture, right? So at the other side is Jim's question about humanitarian groups, NGOs, but let's also point out that there's also other government institutions in between, right? So Japan has, like, JICA, which used to have very strict rules about cooperating with any kind of security related apparatus, and those rules have loosened quite a bit. We have, the US has its own, USAID and other things. So I think that Jim is onto something important, that to look at lasting assistance, we do need to integrate these operations overall. But I guess linking to my opening remarks, I would just say that although I think that it's really important that the US and Japan both continue to provide this assistance on an urgent basis, I don't think we should think of our militaries as humanitarian relief organizations. I think we should think of them more as immediate responders to urgent needs. And then, I think the coordination with the NGOs that Jim is getting at is really important, to have continuity, right? How do you pass off that initial response then to, the people who can stay on the ground longer? It's a bit of a rambling response, but that would be my initial take.
That's wonderful. And I'm sorry to our panelists who might also have other comments on that, and to others who had more questions. They keep coming in right at the last minute, but we are out of time. It is 4 p.m. now in Washington, so I'm going to have to bring this webinar to a close. I'd like to again thank our three panelists for their wonderful and fascinating insights on this important topic. And I'd like to thank all the participants in the audience for joining. And finally, I'd like to once again thank the Embassy of Japan and the Public Affairs section for their support of this series and of the Mansfield Foundation more generally. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Aloha.